While Donald Trump stood in the Oval Office on December 8, 2025, announcing a $12 billion bailout for struggling American farmers, he was at the exact same time threatening to impose severe tariffs on the one thing those same farmers cannot function without: Canadian potash. The irony was almost perfect. A president publicly rescuing farmers from a crisis his own policies created, while privately preparing to make that crisis dramatically worse. This is not about abstract trade policy. This is not about negotiation tactics or political theater. This is about fertilizer, the most basic, non-optional input of modern agriculture. Without it, crops do not grow, yields collapse, costs explode, and food prices follow. Here is the reality most Americans never hear. The United States imports nearly 90% of its potash, and of that imported supply, more than 80% comes from a single place: Saskatchewan, Canada. There is no backup. There is no emergency stockpile. There is no quick alternative supplier. American agriculture depends on Canadian potash the same way a hospital depends on electricity. You do not disrupt it without consequences. And yet, in March 2025, Trump did exactly that. As part of his broader trade war strategy, he imposed a 25% tariff on Canadian potash. The reaction from the agricultural sector was immediate and brutal. Fertilizer represents between 30 and 45% of a farmer's operating costs, depending on the crop. A tariff of that size does not reduce profits, it erases them. For a large corn or soybean operation, fertilizer expenses can reach hundreds of thousands of dollars per year. A 25% price shock does not hurt. It destroys. Farmers cannot pass those costs to consumers. They sell into global commodity markets. They take the loss or they go bankrupt. Within days, agricultural organizations were warning of a disaster. The American Soybean Association stated that farmers were already facing their third consecutive year of losses. Not small losses, existential ones. Under pressure, the administration reduced the tariff from 25% to 10% in early March and declared victory. But markets do not work that way. Once prices move up, they do not magically return to previous levels. By September 2025, the U.S. Import Price Index for chemical fertilizers had jumped from 164.5 to 186.5. That is a 13% increase in less than 1 year. Fertilizer costs became the single largest driver of rising input expenses across American agriculture. Farmers were paying more, producing at a loss, and heading straight toward government bailouts. Which brings us back to that December press conference. Trump announces $12 billion in emergency aid, and projections show farmers will receive nearly $40 billion in total government payments for the year. Think about that. American taxpayers are now subsidizing the damage caused by a tariff that was supposed to make America stronger. During Trump's first term, he paid $23 billion in farm bailouts because of his trade wars. Now, in his second term, he is on track to nearly double that. This is not protectionism. This is a feedback loop of self-inflicted damage. And here is the part that makes it even more absurd. There is no American potash industry to protect. Potash is not something you build with policy. It is not something you invent. It is geology. Saskatchewan sits on top of 1.1 billion tons of potash reserves. That is roughly 5 times what the United States has. In 2024, Canada produced 36 times more potash than the U.S. The United States produces around 400,000 tons per year. American farmers need millions. Even if Washington decided today to become self-sufficient, new mines would take 10 to 15 years to open and require billions in subsidies, with no guarantee of long-term profitability. And even then, they would not come close to replacing Canadian supply. Meanwhile, Canada is expanding. BHP's massive Jansen mine in Saskatchewan is scheduled to begin production in 2027, adding 4 million tons per year, with another expansion phase likely in the 2030s. By the time American mines come online, Canada will be producing even more, at even lower costs, with even more pricing power. This is not a trade imbalance. This is a structural dependency. And Trump decided to weaponize it anyway. Which brings us to the most dangerous consequence of all. Because when you make Canadian potash more expensive, American farmers only have three options: pay more, use less fertilizer, and accept lower yields, or find another supplier. And there is only one country on Earth that can realistically replace Canada at scale: Russia. And that is where this story stops being merely incompetent and starts becoming strategically insane. When Trump imposed tariffs on Canadian potash, he did not just create a domestic farm crisis, he created a geopolitical problem. Because once you make Canadian fertilizer artificially expensive, you force American farmers to look elsewhere. And in the global potash market, there is only one alternative supplier with the scale to matter: Russia. Along with Belarus, Russia controls roughly 37% of the world's potash production. They have the mines, they have the logistics, and in the middle of a brutal and expensive war in Ukraine, they desperately need export revenue. This is where Trump's policy turns from misguided to strategically incoherent. The United States is leading the Western coalition trying to economically isolate Russia. Sanctions, export controls, financial pressure, and yet, Trump's tariff on Canadian potash creates a scenario where American farmers could end up buying fertilizer from the very country Washington is trying to bankrupt. Saskatchewan's own premier said it plainly: if American farmers cannot afford Canadian potash, they will buy it somewhere else. And that somewhere else is Russia. Think about the optics, and then think about the consequences. American money flowing into Russian mining companies, helping finance a war the United States is trying to stop. All because Washington decided to punish its closest ally instead of managing a structural dependency. And here is the deeper irony. Canada saw this coming years ago. For more than a decade, Canadian producers have been quietly diversifying away from the U.S. market. In 2000, the United States was the dominant destination for Saskatchewan potash. By 2025, while the U.S. still represents roughly half of exports, that share has been steadily shrinking as Canada expands into Brazil, China, and Southeast Asia. Trump's tariffs did not trap Canada. They accelerated Canada's exit. Nutrien, the world's largest potash producer, began redirecting investment toward export infrastructure serving non-U.S. markets. New shipping routes, new port capacity, new long-term contracts with emerging economies that are increasing fertilizer consumption every year. Canada is hedging against American volatility. American farmers cannot. This is the asymmetry no one in Washington wants to talk about. If Canada loses U.S. market share, it finds new buyers. If American farmers lose Canadian supply, they face higher costs, lower yields, or dependence on geopolitically hostile suppliers. That is not leverage. That is vulnerability. And the vulnerability shows up fast. When fertilizer prices spike, farmers do not immediately go bankrupt. They do something more dangerous. They cut usage. They apply less potash per acre. They reduce planted acreage. They accept lower yields. That protects cash flow in the short term and damages food production in the medium term. Lower yields mean higher food prices. Not someday, next season. This is how a fertilizer tariff becomes a grocery inflation problem. And remember, farmers cannot hedge this risk. They cannot delay planting. They cannot negotiate prices with the weather. They operate in a biological system with fixed timelines and fixed needs, which is why uncertainty itself becomes a form of damage. Heading into the next planting season, American farmers still do not know whether Trump will escalate again. The tariff was reduced, not removed. The threat remains, and markets price threats, not just actions. This is why fertilizer prices did not return to normal even after the tariff was lowered. The risk premium stayed. Suppliers priced in political volatility. Distributors priced in future disruptions. And farmers paid the bill. Now, here is where the national security story becomes unavoidable. If the United States pushes farmers toward Russian supply, even partially, it creates a split inside its own strategic policy. One arm of the government tries to isolate Moscow. Another arm indirectly funds it. That is not a strategy. That is a contradiction. And it gets worse, because Russia is not just a supplier. It is a price weapon. If Russia decides to undercut Canadian prices to capture market share in the US, it can. And once dependency shifts, it becomes harder to reverse. This is exactly how strategic dependencies are created. Short-term cost relief, long-term geopolitical exposure. And this is not theoretical. Europe learned this lesson the hard way with natural gas. Cheap Russian supply looked rational until it became a weapon. Trump is now recreating the same vulnerability in American agriculture, all while claiming to defend farmers. Which brings us to the most perverse outcome of all. The more damage his tariffs cause, the more government bailouts are required. Taxpayers subsidize the harm. Farmers become dependent on emergency aid. And the underlying structural problem remains completely unsolved. And meanwhile, Canada continues expanding capacity, signing new contracts, and reducing its reliance on the U.S. The potash relationship that took generations to build is being dismantled in a few months, not because of market forces, because of ideology. And that sets up the final and unavoidable question. What happens when you try to fix a geological dependency with political slogans? The answer is not strength, it is fragility. And in Part 3, we are going to look at where this path leads, not just for farmers, but for food prices, national security, and the long-term competitiveness of the American economy. Because this is not just a fertilizer story. This is a case study in how economic nationalism turns structural reality into strategic weakness. At this point, the potash tariff is no longer a trade dispute. It is a structural trap. Because once you politicize an input as fundamental as fertilizer, you do not just affect farmers, you reshape the entire food system. And food systems are slow, fragile, and brutally unforgiving to bad policy. Let us start with the unavoidable chain reaction. When fertilizer prices remain elevated, farmers do three things. They plant fewer acres, they apply less fertilizer per acre, and they accept lower yields, not because they want to, because they have to protect cash flow. That means less corn, less soy, less wheat, and that means higher prices for everything that depends on them. Bread, meat, dairy, cooking oil, animal feed, biofuels. Food inflation does not arrive as a headline. It arrives as a permanent background pressure on every household budget. And unlike energy prices, food prices are politically radioactive. Every government in history that loses control of food costs loses legitimacy. Now add the second layer, government bailouts. Trump has already normalized emergency payments to farmers as a substitute for stable trade policy. During his first term, it was $23 billion. In his second term, projections approach $40 billion. That is not support. That is dependency. Once farmers restructure their businesses around bailout cycles, the political cost of fixing the underlying problem skyrockets. You cannot suddenly remove aid without triggering mass bankruptcies, so the policy failure becomes permanent. Taxpayers pay. Farmers survive. The structural weakness remains. And here is the cruel irony. None of this builds a domestic potash industry. The geology does not change. Even the subsidized mines will take a decade to matter. And when they do, they will be higher cost than Canadian production and vulnerable to global price competition. So the U.S. ends up with the worst of both worlds. Higher input costs, permanent subsidies, and continued import dependence. Now zoom out to the geopolitical level. Canada adapts. Russia exploits. The United States pays. Canada expands exports to Brazil and Asia. Russia positions itself as a discount alternative, and American agriculture becomes exposed to two suppliers instead of one. That is not diversification. That is strategic confusion. And remember, food security is national security. Any country that cannot reliably control the cost and availability of food inputs is vulnerable to internal instability and external pressure. History is very clear on this. Empires do not fall because they lose wars. They fall because they lose price stability. And now look at what this policy signals to the world. It tells allies that long-term reliability is conditional. It tells competitors that U.S. policy is reactive and ideological. And it tells markets that strategic sectors can be weaponized without regard for consequences. That raises risk premiums across the board. Capital becomes cautious, investment slows, insurance costs rise, volatility becomes permanent. All from a tariff that protects no American industry and harms the one it claims to defend. This is not strength. This is what fragility looks like when it is wrapped in nationalist language. And that is the real lesson of the potash debacle. You cannot tariff your way out of geology. You cannot slogan your way out of supply chains. And you cannot subsidize your way out of structural reality. The United States had a stable, reliable, boring, efficient potash relationship with Canada for generations. Trump broke it. Not for leverage, not for strategy, not for security, but for optics. And the bill will not be paid by politicians. It will be paid by farmers, consumers, and taxpayers. Quietly. Every season, every grocery trip, every tax cycle. This is how bad policy becomes a permanent tax on society. And unless this is reversed, the potash tariff will be remembered not as a trade dispute, but as the moment American agriculture was pushed into long-term structural weakness by its own government.